At
This route is the most
5:12
efficient, sir.
a.m.,
It cuts
my
right
phone
through my
started
best pasture.
vibrating nonstop.
We've
Not a
adjusted the
call,
compensation
not a
package.
message.
See?
Just
right here.
notification
Lower it
after
slowly.
notification from my security cameras. At first, I thought it was
Watch the
coyotes
change.
again. They've been sneaking
right,
along
set
the
it down
fence
easy.
line all week. But when I opened the live feed, my stomach dropped. Headlights, dozens of them, machines, men in reflective vests, and a bulldozer sitting right in the middle of my wheat field. By the time I threw on my boots and ran outside, the sun was barely touching the horizon. The morning air still smelled like wet soil and alfalfa, the way it always had since my grandfather bought this land almost 60 years ago. This farm isn't just property to me. It's our history, our income, our family's entire life. And right there, cutting across the center of it like a scar, was a brand new dirt road. No warning, no letter, no knock on the door, just a road. At first, I honestly thought it was a mistake. Maybe the construction crew got the wrong address. Maybe someone misread a boundary map. Because no one in their right mind would build a road across private farmland overnight, right? I walked up to one of the workers and asked what was going on. He didn't even look surprised to see me. He just shrugged and said the sentence that still echoes in my head. You'll have to talk to the HOA. The HOA. Here's the thing. My farm isn't even inside their neighborhood. The subdivision sits about half a mile down the highway. Rows of identical houses, trimmed lawns, matching mailboxes, and the kind of rules that tell you what color your curtains can be. I live in a farmhouse surrounded by acres of crops and open sky. No shared fence, no shared gate, no shared anything. So why was there a road running straight through my land? When I called the HOA office, they acted like this had all been settled weeks ago. They talked about community access, approved plans, and easements. Big legal words delivered in calm voices, like they expected me to just say, okay, and move on. But I never signed anything. I never agreed to anything. And yet by sunrise, cars from the neighborhood were already using it. Parents dropping kids at the school bus stop. Joggers waving like they were passing through a public park. A man even slowed down to thank me for the shortcut. Shortcut. That word hit harder than the bulldozer. Because what they saw as convenience was cutting my farm in half. It split irrigation lines, destroyed crops, and opened my property to constant traffic. Years of work undone in one night. Standing there, watching strangers drive across land my grandfather once plowed with his own hands, I realized something that made my chest tighten. They thought this road was permanent. They thought I couldn't stop it. What they didn't know was that by sunset the next day, that road would be completely closed. And I would do it with one legal move they never saw coming. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear tires crunching over gravel that hadn't existed 24 hours earlier. Headlights kept sweeping across my bedroom ceiling like slow-moving searchlights. It felt like my own home had suddenly become a roadside motel. By morning, the road was busy. Commuters from the subdivision were already using it as their new shortcut to the highway. A steady line of SUVs and pickup trucks rolled straight through the middle of my farm like they'd been doing it for years. Some drivers waved politely. Some avoided eye contact. One woman even smiled and gave me a thumbs up as if I had personally built the road for her morning convenience. That was the moment the reality hit me hardest. They didn't think they were trespassing. They thought this was normal. I grew up on this land. My earliest memories are here, running between irrigation rows, sitting on the tailgate with my dad at sunset, learning how to read the sky for rain before I even learned long division. My grandfather used to say the farm was like a living thing. You care for it, protect it, and in return, it takes care of your family. Watching strangers drive across it felt like someone had punched a hole straight through our history. And the damage wasn't just emotional. The road cut directly across one of our main irrigation routes. The trenching had severed underground water lines. Tire tracks flattened a section of young wheat that had taken months of work to grow. Every vehicle that passed kicked dust into nearby crops, coating the leaves in a thin gray film. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was financial damage. I spent most of that morning making calls, the county office, the zoning department, the land records clerk. Each call added another layer of confusion. No permits under my property ID. No recorded easement. No right-of-way application tied to my parcel. Nothing. It was like the road had appeared out of thin air. By noon, I drove down to the HOA office myself. The building looked exactly like you'd expect. Spotless landscaping, shiny glass doors, and a lobby that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. A woman at the front desk greeted me with the kind of professional smile that disappears the second you ask a difficult question. When I explained who I was, her expression changed just slightly, like she suddenly realized she'd been expecting this visit. She asked me to wait. 10 minutes later, I was sitting across from two board members in a conference room that felt colder than it should have. They spoke calmly, confidently, like people used to being in control. They explained how the neighborhood had been dealing with traffic congestion for years. The main entrance backed up during school hours. Emergency vehicles had complained about response times. Their solution: a secondary access road, straight through my farm. They slid a folder across the table. Inside were maps, plans, and emails discussing the project like it was already a done deal. They kept repeating the same phrase, community benefit. I kept repeating the same answer: you don't own that land. That's when they mentioned something that made my stomach twist. They said the road was built based on legal access assumptions. Assumptions. Not permission. Not approval. Not ownership. Assumptions. And the way they said it, calm, confident, almost rehearsed, made it clear they believed those assumptions would protect them. As I left the office, I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was a fight. And somewhere buried in paperwork, maps, and legal language was the reason they thought they could take my land and turn it into a public shortcut. I just had to find it before the road became impossible to remove. The first person who told me to just let it go was my neighbor Tom. He leaned against the fence that afternoon, watching cars roll through the field like it was rush hour in the middle of nowhere. Tom's family had farmed the land next to ours for almost as long as we had. He understood property lines the way some people understand family trees, which is why his advice surprised me. Fighting an HOA is like wrestling fog, he said. You swing and end up exhausted while they keep moving. Normally, I trusted Tom's instincts. He'd seen land disputes drag on for years. Court dates, lawyer fees, stress that aged people faster than the sun ever could. But something in me refused to accept that this was just how things were supposed to go. Because if I let this happen, what stopped it from happening again? A wider road next year. A utility line the year after. Maybe sidewalks someday. Piece by piece, convenience would eat the farm alive. And the truth I didn't say out loud, the one that made my chest feel tight, was that the farm was already under pressure. Crop prices had been unpredictable for years. Fuel costs kept climbing. One bad season could push us dangerously close to selling land just to stay afloat. Losing part of the farm now wasn't just emotional. It was dangerous. That evening, my dad came over. He didn't say much at first. He just walked the edge of the new road slowly, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes fixed on the ground. He'd grown up here, worked this soil longer than I had. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded quieter than I'd ever heard it. Your grandfather would be furious. Not angry, not upset, furious. Then he added something that stayed with me all night. But he'd also tell you to be smart, not stubborn. That word stung more than I expected, because deep down, I knew stubbornness ran in our family like a genetic trait. The farm existed today because my grandfather refused to sell during a drought that bankrupted half the county. My dad kept it going through years when everyone said small farms were finished. Now was my turn, and I didn't know if I was protecting the farm or risking it. The next complication came 2 days later. A letter arrived in the mail from a law firm representing the HOA. The language was polite, almost friendly, but the message underneath felt heavy. They claimed the road was built under a good faith belief of legal access. They talked about cooperation, mutual solutions, and community relationships. Then came the line that made my hands tighten around the paper. They warned that blocking the road could create liability concerns. It wasn't a threat. Not directly, but it was close enough. Suddenly, the situation felt bigger than a property dispute. It felt like they were preparing for a legal battle, one they believed they could win. And for the first time, doubt crept in. What if they were right? What if somewhere in decades-old paperwork there really was a forgotten easement? Some clause buried in a deed from generations ago. Farms change hands. Records get messy. Mistakes happen. That night, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by old documents. Deeds, maps, surveys, tax records. Papers my grandfather had kept in boxes labeled in careful handwriting. The smell of dust and old ink filled the room as the clock ticked past midnight. Every page felt like a piece of a puzzle I didn't know how to solve. That's when my wife quietly placed a mug of coffee beside me and asked the question I'd been avoiding. How far are you willing to go? I didn't answer right away, because the honest answer scared me. Fighting this could mean lawyers, court, money we didn't really have, months, maybe years of stress. There was a real chance we could lose. And if we lost, the road would become permanent. But if we didn't fight, the message would be clear: our land was negotiable. Around midnight, I found an old survey map folded between two tax records. The paper was yellowed and fragile, edges curling from age. A red line traced the property boundary in thick ink, drawn decades before the subdivision even existed. I stared at that line for a long time, because something about it didn't match the HOA's maps. Not even close. My pulse started to pick up as a new possibility formed, one that felt equal parts hopeful and terrifying. What if their assumptions were built on the wrong map? What if the road wasn't just inconvenient? What if it was completely illegal? I folded the survey carefully and placed it back on the table, staring at it like it might disappear if I blinked. Outside, another car drove across the farm, its headlights sweeping across the dark field. For the first time since the bulldozers arrived, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not fear, a plan beginning to take shape. And I had a feeling the HOA had no idea what they'd just started. The next morning, I called a land surveyor. Not the one listed on the HOA documents. Not anyone remotely connected to the subdivision. I wanted someone neutral, someone whose name didn't already appear in their neat little folder of assumptions. When he arrived 2 days later, he walked the property in silence for nearly an hour, measuring, marking, checking coordinates against the old survey map I'd found. Every few minutes he'd stop, stare down the line of the road, then look back at the documents in his hands. The longer he stayed quiet, the louder my heartbeat felt. Finally, he stopped near the center of the dirt road, right where the tire tracks had carved the deepest grooves into the soil, and drove a small wooden stake in the ground. Then another, and another, each one lined up in a perfectly straight row that cut directly across the road. He turned to me and said words that made the world feel suddenly still. "This is your boundary." I looked from his stakes to the road, then back to him. "All of it?" I asked. He nodded. "All of it." The road wasn't partially on my land. Not mostly. Not by a few feet. Completely. Every inch of gravel. Every trench. Every tire track. The HOA hadn't just crossed the boundary. They'd ignored it entirely. For a moment, relief washed over me like a wave. The kind of relief that makes your knees feel weak. But it didn't last long, because relief quickly gave way to something heavier. Now I knew the truth, which meant a confrontation was coming, and the stakes had just doubled. That afternoon, I called the number on the HOA letter. I kept my voice calm, professional. I told them a new survey confirmed the road was fully on private property and asked when they planned to remove it. The silence on the other end stretched longer than it should have. Then the board member cleared his throat and said something that shifted the tension again. "We'll need to review that information." Review. Delay. Deflect. I could almost hear the gears turning behind the words. By evening, the neighborhood Facebook group had discovered the situation. Someone had posted a photo of the survey stakes crossing the road like a warning line. Comments poured in faster than I could read them. Some people were sympathetic. Others were angry. A few insisted the road had to stay because emergency access was too important. One comment stood out more than the rest. He wouldn't actually block it, right? I stared at that sentence for a long time, because until that moment, the idea had still felt theoretical. A possibility, a legal option sitting quietly in the background. But now the neighborhood was talking about it like a looming storm. The next morning proved just how fast tension was rising. Two HOA board members showed up at my gate unannounced. They didn't smile this time. We stood beside the road, dust swirling around our boots as cars slowed to watch. The conversation stayed polite on the surface, but the air between us felt tight, stretched thin like a wire ready to snap. They talked about compromise, temporary agreements, future negotiations, words that sounded cooperative but avoided the one thing that mattered: removing the road. When I asked directly if they planned to stop using my land, their answer came wrapped in careful language. It's not that simple. 3 words. That's all it took to confirm what I'd been feeling. They weren't planning to back down. One of them gestured toward the steady stream of cars driving past us. Closing this now would create a serious disruption for the community. Community. The same word they'd used in every email, every letter, every conversation. Like repeating it enough times could turn private property into public convenience. I glanced at the survey stakes cutting across the road. Thin wooden markers standing quietly in the dust. Proof. Boundaries. Reality. And for the first time, I realized something important. They didn't believe I would actually stop them. Maybe they thought the legal process would scare me. Maybe they assumed the cost, the stress, the conflict would make me hesitate long enough for the road to become permanent. Maybe they thought I'd choose peace over principle. That night, I sat at the kitchen table again, the same place where this fight had started, and spread the documents out in front of me. Survey results, property records, the HOA letter, photos of the road cutting through the crops. The plan forming in my head was simple, fast, completely legal. And once it happened, there would be no easy way for them to undo it. Outside, headlights passed across the field again. A steady stream of cars using the shortcut like they always had, like they always would. Unless I acted. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I'd been staring at for hours. When a man on the other end answered, I asked one question. How quickly can we install a gate? There was a pause. Then he replied, how big of a gate are we talking? I looked out the window at the road running through the center of my farm. Big enough to close a road. The gate company said they could install it in 2 days. 2 days. For the first time since the bulldozers arrived, I felt like I had control over the timeline instead of the other way around. Every car that passed across the farm now felt like a countdown. 48 hours until the shortcut disappeared. I didn't announce anything publicly. No social media posts. No neighborhood warnings. Just quiet preparation. Measurements taken. Materials ordered. Legal paperwork double-checked by a property attorney who confirmed what the surveyor already had. The road sat entirely on private land. No easement. No agreement. No legal access. It was simple, which is why what happened next blindsided me. The twist came from somewhere I never expected, the county office. I was halfway through the morning chores when my phone rang. Unknown number. Normally, I let it go to voicemail, but something told me to answer. The man on the line introduced himself from the county planning department. His tone was polite, but careful, like someone choosing every word before speaking. He asked if I'd recently contacted the HOA about the road. I said yes. He paused for a moment, then said, we've received an urgent request regarding your property. My grip tightened around the phone. What kind of request? Another pause. They've applied for an emergency access easement. The words landed like a sudden drop in temperature. Emergency access. Easement. 2 phrases that changed everything. I stopped walking. The barn, the fields, the distant hum of traffic. It all faded into the background as the implication hit me. If approved, that easement could turn their mistake into something permanent. Retroactive permission. A legal shortcut to match the physical one they'd already built. They built the road without permission, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I understand, the man replied. This is a new filing. It hasn't been approved, but it's being reviewed quickly. Quickly. Of course it was. Suddenly, the 2-day timeline for the gate didn't feel comfortable anymore. It felt dangerous, like a race had quietly started without me knowing. I asked the question that mattered most. Do they know I'm planning to close the road? Silence. Then the man cleared his throat. They mentioned concerns that the access might be restricted soon. So they knew, not just guessed. Knew, which meant someone had told them. I ended the call and stood there staring across the field, a knot tightening in my chest. My mind ran through every conversation from the past week, every phone call, every meeting, every person who'd known about the gate. The list was short, very short, and one name rose to the surface faster than the rest. Tom, the neighbor who told me fighting the HOA was pointless. The neighbor who'd watched the road with quiet concern. The neighbor whose property now sat at the end of a new shortcut. I didn't want to believe it. I really didn't. But the pieces slid together too neatly to ignore. The HOA had moved fast, too fast, the moment the gate became real. I drove to Tom's place before I could talk myself out of it. His truck was in the driveway. The road between our properties, the same dirt road that had started this entire mess, stretched behind me like evidence. When he stepped outside and saw my face, his shoulders sank before I even said a word. That was all the confirmation I needed. I didn't think they'd move this fast, he said quietly. Not denial, not confusion, an apology before the accusation. He explained how the HOA had approached him weeks ago, how they promised the road would improve emergency access for the whole rural area, not just the subdivision, how they'd said it would increase property values, reduce response times, benefit everyone. He thought it was inevitable, thought resistance would only drag the fight out longer. So when he overheard me talking about the gate, he warned them. I was trying to prevent a bigger fight, he said. But the fight was already here, and now the clock was ticking louder than ever. The HOA wasn't waiting anymore. They were racing to make the road legal before I could close it. 2 timelines, 2 plans, moving toward the same piece of land. And only one of us could win that race. The gate went up at sunrise. No announcement, no warning. Just the sound of metal posts being driven into the ground while the sky slowly turned from gray to gold. The crew worked fast, like they understood the urgency without needing it explained. Every clang of steel felt like a countdown, finally hitting 0. By 7:15 a.m., the last panel swung into place. A wide, heavy farm gate stretched across the road from fence line to fence line. Thick chain, industrial lock. A bright sign bolted to the center, private property, and no trespassing for a few seconds. Nothing happened. Then the first SUV rolled up. It slowed, stopped, sat there like the driver was waiting for the gate to magically open. Another car pulled in behind it. Then another. Within minutes, a small line of morning commuters stretched across the dirt road that had been busy just yesterday. Some drivers turned around quietly. Others stepped out of their cars, staring at the sign like it personally offended them. One man walked up to the fence and read the notice twice, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more convenient. My phone started ringing before the dust even settled. The HOA. I let go to voicemail. The next call came 10 minutes later. Then another. Emails followed. Urgent subject lines. Words like disruption and liability and immediate discussion. By mid-morning, a county vehicle pulled up near the gate. The same planning officer stepped out, holding a clipboard and wearing an expression that told me he already knew how this was going to end. He inspected the gate, checked the survey stakes, compared documents. Finally, he walked over and said the words I'd been waiting to hear for weeks. You're within your rights to restrict access. Simple, clear, final. The road was closed. For the first time since the bulldozers showed up, the farm was quiet again. No Indians, no those clouds, just wind moving through the crops like it always had. I expected relief to feel triumphant. Instead, it felt heavy, because the fight wasn't completely over yet. 3 days later, the county made their decision on the HOA's emergency easement request. Denied. Their filing had moved fast, just like the officer warned. But so had the evidence. The survey, the timeline, the photos showing construction without permits or permission. The gate didn't block legal access. It stopped unauthorized use. Their shortcut had never existed legally, and now it never would. The HOA sent one final letter a week later. The tone had changed completely, gone with the confident phrases and polished language. In their place were words like regret and misunderstanding and future cooperation. They offered to restore the damaged irrigation lines and compensate for crop loss. The road crew returned soon after. Watching them tear the road out felt surreal. The same machines that carved it into the earth now erased it piece by piece. Gravel scraped away, trenches filled, soil leveled. Within days, the scar that had cut the farm in half was gone, almost like it had never happened. Almost. The unexpected twist came the day Tom walked over again. He didn't lean on the fence this time. He stood a few feet back, hands in his pockets, looking at the freshly leveled field. "They approached me first because of something your grandfather did," he said. "That caught me off guard." Tom explained that decades ago, before the subdivision existed, my grandfather had allowed emergency vehicles to cross the farm during a wildfire. No contracts, no paperwork, just a handshake and a promise to help if the community ever needed it. A story passed down, retold, misinterpreted over time. Somewhere along the way, a single act of generosity had turned into an assumption of permanent access. The HOA hadn't invented the idea out of thin air. They'd built their plan on a story that had grown bigger than the truth. I stood there looking across the field where the road used to run, imagining my grandfather shaking hands with a firefighter all those years ago, trying to help in a moment of crisis, never imagining that decades later, that kindness would echo back as a legal battle. That realization changed how the whole story felt. This wasn't just about property lines. It was about how easily good intentions can turn into expectations, and how expectations can turn into entitlement. The farm was quiet again, whole again, and the boundary line, the one drawn in red ink so many years ago, meant exactly what it always had. Not a barrier, a responsibility, one that now felt heavier than ever. A few weeks after the road disappeared, the farm finally felt like itself again. The silence came back first. No early morning traffic, no dust drifting across the fields, no strangers waving from car windows like they were passing through a public park. Just wind moving through the crops and the slow rhythm of everyday farm life settling back into place. I didn't realize how much tension I'd been carrying until it was gone. But closure doesn't arrive all at once. It shows up in small moments. Like the day the repaired irrigation line started running again. I stood there watching water move through the pipes, steady and quiet, feeding the crops the way it always had. Weeks earlier, that same line had been cut open by trenching equipment. Now it felt like a symbol of everything slowly being put back together. The HOA kept their word about compensation. The letter that once felt like a warning had turned into paperwork finalizing payments for the crop damage and restoration work. It wasn't victory in the dramatic sense. No courtroom speeches. No dramatic apologies. Just accountability. And honestly, that felt more real. The neighborhood eventually built a proper secondary entrance on land they actually owned. Construction lasted months. Detours, budget meetings, permits, surveys, everything the right way this time. Funny how complicated things become when shortcuts disappear. I ran into one of the board members months later at a local hardware store. We stood in the aisle for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. He nodded and said, "We should have handled it differently." Simple words, late but sincere. And that was enough. Tom and I took longer to get back to normal. Betrayal doesn't vanish as quickly as a dirt road. For a while, conversation stayed short and careful. Polite waves instead of long chats at the fence. But farms don't really allow grudges to last forever. Too many shared seasons. Too many shared storms. One evening, he showed up with a toolbox and helped fix a broken section of fencing without being asked. We worked side by side in comfortable silence until the sun dipped below the horizon. No big speeches. No dramatic apologies. Just presence. Sometimes that's how trust begins to grow back. The biggest change, though, was inside me. Before all of this, property lines were just lines on a map. Something you trusted existed because paperwork said so. Now they feel different. Heavier. More real. Not because they keep people out, but because they define what you're responsible for protecting. This fight was never really about a road. It was about boundaries. About understanding the difference between community and convenience. Between assumption and permission. Between kindness and entitlement. My grandfather believed in helping neighbors when they truly needed it. A wildfire. An emergency. A real crisis. The kind of generosity built strong communities long before HOAs and legal filings existed. But even generosity needs clarity, because when kindness isn't clearly defined, it can slowly transform into expectation. And expectation can quietly turn into something else, something louder, something harder to undo. Now, when I walk across the field where the road once ran, you can't see any sign of what happened. The soil has settled. The crops grow evenly. The land looks the same as it did before the bulldozers arrived. But I know exactly where it was. I always will. It's the place that taught me one of the most important lessons of my life. Boundaries don't make you a bad neighbor. They make you a responsible one. If this story made you think or reminded you why standing up for what matters is never easy, but always worth it, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to protect what was yours? I'd love to hear your story. And remember this line, because it's the one I'll carry with me every time I look out across this farm. Good fences don't divide people. They teach them where respect begins.